Good morning, everyone. I am Sarah Rosen-Wortel, and I am honored to be the president of the Urban Institute and to welcome you here today for this really extraordinary program on behalf not only of my colleagues here at Urban, but also our partners at the Saul Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California, for a discussion of an important new analysis by the National Academy of Sciences on immigration's economic and fiscal impacts on our larger economy and on Americans and communities. Our goal today is to better understand also the potential role of immigrants when effectively integrated into our economy in the future prosperity of our country as a whole, and as the day evolves, focus more on our cities and communities. I invite all of you who are in the room and those of you online, welcome also, to join the conversation, taking advantage of the hashtag #LiveAtUrban so everyone will see your comments. And for those of you who are online live, I know there'll be many watching this broadcast later, but those of you who are online live or watching on our C-SPAN audience, who we also welcome, you can send comments to us at events@urban.org, and we'll get them to the panel moderators for the discussion. At Urban, we're excited about this being the beginning of a deeper collaboration on these issues between the Urban Institute and the Saul Price School under the leadership of Gary Painter, who's Director of Social Policy at the Price School for at the Saul Price Center for Social Innovation, and Urban Institute's own Senior Fellow, Audrey Singer. And more about that in a minute. But first, let me just briefly mention the occasion that draws us here. Yesterday, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a report entitled The Economic and Fiscal Consequences of Immigration, which is a comprehensive examination of these issues and the ways in which immigrants have driven change in our society since 1997. The Academy's convened 15 experts on a world-class academic, nonpartisan panel led by Professor Francine Blau, Professor of Economics at Cornell University. Some of the facts you find in digging through that report. Over 40 million people in the United States today were born in other countries, and an equal number have at least one immigrant parent. Together, those immigrants and near relations of immigrants make up a quarter of Americans. A growing share of our working population are immigrants, and almost nearly all of the growth in our future workforce is expected to come from immigrants and their families. The panel in the report discussed how the nature of changes in our population in the last 20 years. The number of foreign-born have doubled since 1990 and are now 13% of our population. And that includes naturalized citizens, temporary visas, green cards, refugees, and the undocumented. The number of the undocumented, 11 million, has been constant since 2009, with about 300,000 to 400,000 immigrants joining our country illegally and a similar number leaving each year. There are 1 million legal permanent residents also arrive each year. So what's the impact? The National Academy's press release read, "Immigration's long-term impacts on overall wages and unemployment of the native-born U.S. workers are very small. Although low-skilled workers may be affected," a new report finds. "Impacts on economic growth are positive, while effects on government budgets are mixed." That's a nuanced headline, and unfortunately, nuance doesn't always, at first blush, convey very well in public debate. This morning, I looked at the news cycle comments on the report. The New York Times headline said, "Immigrants aren't taking American jobs, new study finds." And the Washington Times headline read, "Immigration drains the economy, sapping $296 billion a year from federal, state, and local taxes while depressing wages." So people are finding a little bit of what and then they did add, "at least in the short run." So people are looking for what they want to find. And unfortunately, from my perspective, the press focused far too little on one of the report's key conclusions, which is the ways in which immigration is integral to our future prospect for economic growth. So we like to say at the Urban Institute, we elevate the debate. And today's discussion is intended to elevate and mine this incredibly rich, sophisticated, and really terrific body of work. We are very excited also that one of the panel members was one of our own. Kim Rubin, Senior Fellow and Project Director of State and Local Finance Initiative here, was a member of the panel, as was one of USC's faculty, Dowell Myers, who's not with us today. Oh, I'm sorry. Pardon me. I had the wrong list in front of me when I was writing my notes. My apologies, Dowell. I had so Kim's panel, the first panel is going to introduce the report, and we're delighted also to have from USC, Roberto Suro to moderate. Roberto is teaching at both the Annenberg School of Communications and Journalism and the Price School of Public Policy. He directs the Thomas Rivera Policy Institute, and he has a long history of studying and writing about immigration policy, first as a journalist at New York Times and the Washington Post, among other places, and then as a founding director of the Pew Hispanic Center. After that, we'll have a second panel moderating by Urban's Audrey Singer, and she will introduce then leaders from 3 regions discussing the diverse roles of immigrants. And in particular, we're very excited that our partnership with USC is going to focus on this regional and local impact. We're going to try to better understand the role of immigration in communities and also the ways in which the positive benefits for local economies and for communities that come from immigration can be reinforced, and the barriers to that successful integration that we may have can be removed. Audrey's a senior fellow in our Metro Center, and she's done research on demographic change, immigration, integration for the last 25 years. And she was also recently a member of another National Academies panel on immigrant integration, released just about a year ago. So Roberto and Audrey are going to introduce the rest of our speakers, and I also encourage you all online and in the room to stick around, because at the end we're going to hear from President Obama's chief immigration advisor, the director of the Domestic Policy Council, Cecilia Munoz, who will close out our day. So with that, thank you.
I'll use the visual aid. Hi, thank you, Sarah, and thank you all for coming. We are very excited with the release of the report, which is 3 years in the making. So it's taken a fair amount of energy on our parts and the rest of the members of the commission, and we are very excited to share the results with you today. It was my privilege to serve with my fellow members and examine this important topic. Before we begin our discussion, and most of this will be a discussion where we answer questions and we're not going to go page by page or theory by theory through all 500 pages. I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to stress some of the findings and at least highlight and give you a little bit of a roadmap through the report. So first, a little housekeeping. The project was sponsored by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, who felt that it was worthwhile for a panel to examine and specify what we know about the economic and fiscal consequences of immigration. Little did they know 3 years ago, when they basically decided that it was worth investing in this, where we were going to be in the presidential election cycle right now. We also received support from the National Academy's presidents to finish this work, because it actually took more time and money than they originally anticipated. And it's a follow-up to a study that was done in the 1990s. And they recognize that both the country as a whole and the role of immigrants have changed in the intervening time. The other thing to stress is that independent of the role of immigrants, we went from a rare point in history in the 1990s when we were running fiscal surpluses, right? So it was a country at the end of the last century, we were actually raising more in taxes than we were spending at the federal level. Now we're back to sort of where we were historically, but at a larger level after the Great Recession, where we're running deficits. This is important because when we start talking about the fiscal effects, and some of those things like that headline in the Washington Times, has to do with the fact that immigrants cost more than they're paying in federal taxes, but so does everybody else. So basically, the key thing to note and remember as we're talking about especially what's going on at the fiscal level, the fact that we're running deficits in this country means that if you do an accounting exercise and you're looking at taxes paid versus money spent, we're in the hole. And that has nothing to do with immigrants or any individual person. It just has to do with federally what we're doing right now. And so that's just sort of important to know and to remember, especially as some of these headlines come out, that it's kind of misleading because while immigrants cost money, so do natives. Natives, if you look at a similar headline to the one that was in the Washington Times, would have cost $897 billion in 2013. So it's just something to sort of keep in mind as we move forward. So as noted by Sarah, we examined demographic changes in the country and immigrant population, evaluated research on the economic impacts of immigrants, examining numerous studies and hearing from experts. So we did a pretty exhaustive search of both studies and research reports that were both pro and against what role immigrants are playing in this country. And we had a pretty diverse committee, and we actually hit consensus on sort of what we think the takeaways were. We differentiated in our report, and this is different than some of the other work that was done, between first generation or immigrant populations, second generation or the children of immigrants. So this is sort of people who are native to this country but have at least one foreign-born parent, and other native residents. So if we end up talking about, and I'm probably the one that will be most likely to fall into this nomenclature, of third generation or third or more generation, that just basically means anybody whose parents were not immigrants themselves or immigrants. So it could be people whose grandparents were immigrants, great-grandparents were immigrants, or it could be people whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower. Okay, we're going to skip that because Sarah actually covered it. So some of the other highlights, right? So one of the things that Sarah mentioned that I think is worth stressing is I think we lose sight of the fact that while the number of undocumented immigrants increased from the 1990s through the beginning of this century, beginning in 2007 and through now, the number of unauthorized immigrants has actually been constant, right? We've had people come in and we've had people leave, but there's been sort of a net wash. That's sort of important to remember as we're going forward. So immigrants are also making up an increasing share of our population. They're also making up a larger share of our labor force. So partly what we see, our immigrants are younger than they were historically, and they're also younger than what's been going on sort of with the population in the United States, right? So in the country, natives are actually aging, and more are leaving the workforce and the labor force. And so part of what's sustaining us is the fact that we have immigrants coming in of working age who are working. And so the share of the population in our labor force that is now made up of immigrants has gone from 11% to 16%. And by 2020 to 2030, the only increase in our labor force population is going to come from immigrants or the children of immigrants. So native-born and third-generation folks are actually leaving the labor force population more than they are entering it due to sort of birth rate replacement. And so it's important just to recognize that in order to sustain our labor force, we kind of need a certain level of immigration moving forward. So some other general findings. Immigrants have also more recently entered the country with more education than they had historically. Native-born individuals have also gotten more education. Right now, immigrants are typically overrepresented in two groups. Those without a high school degree, so even though they have more education, there are still a substantial percent that don't have a high school degree, and those with more than a college degree. So right now, we have a disproportionate number of immigrants in those with higher levels of education, especially in the STEM fields, so science and technology. We find that there is little effect overall on the economy, on the role of immigrants in terms of wages and employment. We find that to the extent that there are negative effects, it's sort of concentrated in other people who are most closely the substitutes for newly arrived immigrants. So if there's any effect, and the reports sort of span a large role in terms of showing these effects, it's mainly concentrated in effects on the employment or wages of prior immigrants or other people without a high school degree. We also spend some time, and we'll talk about this more soon, on the role of high-skilled immigrants. We actually find that they contribute positively to the economy, and they actually are complementary with both labor that has a college degree and that without a college degree. And we'll get into that more later. But we actually find that they actually increase economic growth in this country and add to our productivity. If we switch to the fiscal side of things, we actually see a more mixed picture. So again, as I recounted before, we're running deficits. So if you just sort of look at sort of the overall fiscal picture, everything looks pretty bleak in that we're spending more money than we're actually raising in taxes. And while immigrants, if we allocate costs on an average basis, actually consume more than they pay in taxes, a lot of this has to do with how we allocate education costs. So what we do in this study, and one of the issues that we had to decide on, how do you handle children? So if you were going to educate kids, do we actually say that kids should bear the burden of their own costs of what we spend on them, like the cost of education? Or do we say that those are attributable to the parents? And what we do in the report is we actually say that the cost of kids sit with their parents. So for immigrant parents, we assign any costs of sort of children who are under 18 or under 21, so dependents, to those parents, even if those kids are native. And so in general, when we actually find that there are negative effects of immigrants, that's largely coming from the fact that they are younger, have more kids typically, and so at the state and local level, we're spending more on them because we're paying for those education costs. You could, instead of thinking of education as a cost, you can think of it as an investment, in which case we should all bear some of that burden. And in fact, in part of what we do, because we're looking at the adult first, second, and third plus generations, we actually find that the group that contributes the most to the country, both at the federal level and at the state and local level, is actually that second generation. So in part, what we're finding is that that investment we're making in kids is paying off later. Now, most of those returns are felt by the federal government rather than state and local governments, in part because state and local governments actually pay for education while the federal government does, yet the federal government receives a fair amount of that return because of income taxes, which is our main way of paying into the federal government. What's new in the report, too, is we actually do estimates across the 50 states and actually find tremendous variation in sort of what the fiscal benefits and costs are for first, second, and third plus generations across each of the 50 states. I've skipped a bunch of things. We have a lot more going on in the report. I'd say reading the executive summary and the brief is great. Or, you know, if you're bored this weekend, you can get your own copy. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Roberto to start. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me start by introducing the other panelists whose biographies I have in detail. Of Rutgers, an economist, and then Dal Myers, my colleague from USC, who is a demographer and a policy analyst. I would suggest, if you're interested in this topic, immigration, really, or if you're interested in either the economic or fiscal future of the country, that doorstop will be with you for much more than a weekend. This report is, in some ways, a companion volume to the report that Kim mentioned that was done in 1997, the New Americans report. And for people who've been in this field, that really provided a kind of a benchmark, a really important marker in our understanding of the fiscal and economic effects of immigration that has been a consistent influence in the way we think about these issues for 20 years. I think this volume has the same potential in terms of its longevity and influence. It's an extraordinarily complex undertaking that pursues a lot of very detailed subjects, as well as presenting the broad strokes that Kim has presented, and other broad strokes. That was only a part of the overview that you got. So in the time that we have, we will barely scratch the surface of what this document offers in terms of both insights and questions, and ways of formulating questions. It gives us a necessary vocabulary to start assessing these important questions, and takes us from one period of time, the 1990s, into a very different period of time where the dynamics have changed considerably. I want to start with one particular subject, and it's one that relates to what I believe one of the most significant changes in the nature of the immigration flows itself, and particularly in the last few years, which is the increasing numbers of high-skilled immigrants and their impact on the economy. Something that really wasn't that much of an issue in 1997, and now, since the recession, increasingly is an issue, and one that, as our economy is driven by information technologies and other forms of economic activity that rely on brains and human capital in particular, the flow of human capital into the country and the role that immigration policies play in providing that essential economic input, I think is something that this report opens doors on in a way that we haven't seen before. Jenny, I know this is a subject of interest to you, and one aspect of this report that I find very intriguing on this question is a very multidimensional approach to the economic impact of highly skilled or well-educated or entrepreneurial immigrants. And it's not, you don't just measure incomes and jobs, but it's a much more complicated picture. And I was wondering whether you could give us just an introduction to the kind of framework that you present regarding that part of the immigration flow.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to start by saying, though, some people do have the idea, well, we know that skilled immigrants contribute to the economy, but unskilled don't really. I hope to be able to emphasize later that actually all immigrants do contribute to the economy. So I'm going to say talk about some ways in which the skilled immigrants contribute, but that's not implying that they're the only ones that do contribute.
Of course.
But there are two ways in which we think particularly skilled immigrants might contribute that doesn't apply to less skilled immigrants. And one is that they might innovate. It doesn't even necessarily have to be innovate more than natives, because if you come up with a new idea, actually the whole population can benefit from it, rather than, at least eventually after the patent has expired and so forth. Everyone can benefit, and we think that that actually affects economic growth and not just the level of well-being or of economic well-being in the economy. So that's one thing. Of course, it's not only skilled immigrants that innovate, but we think they innovate more than less skilled immigrants or people and workers in general. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is that we think that skilled workers, which would therefore include skilled immigrants, might actually have what we call positive spillovers on their co-workers. So actually it's easy for a professor to think of that in the professorial context, even though that's not typical for the economy. You know, we professors, we try to seek out jobs in departments where there's other very good colleagues, because we know we'll interact with them and they will make us more productive. So similarly, just in general, if you have some skilled immigrant coming into the US, they may actually raise the productivity of now I'm not talking about the entire economy, but a group around them. And nowadays, of course, around you means potentially farther away, also electronically, but face-to-face is still important. So those are two ways. But also in the skilled immigrants contribute in a way we think the unskilled don't. But there are these extra dimensions that you're talking about, some of which do also actually apply to immigrants more generally. So, for example, we think that skilled or even other immigrants coming in affect how natives decide to specialize. So this can actually be looked at in two ways, but the first economic way of thinking about it is that people increase their specialization in what they're good at. So even at the high skill level, there's evidence that when immigrants come, that the natives go into specialties that use language more and communications more intensively, because in general, of course, they speak English better than the immigrants, and that increases the efficiency and productivity of the economy. So that's one. I'm not sure if you have another.
So I was just going to add to that, and I think that is great. The other thing that is true of immigrants more so than natives has to do with entrepreneurship, right? So this could be people who are high skilled or have more education, but it could also be other immigrants who are coming. So they are more likely to start and open small businesses, some of which grow into larger businesses, but also provide jobs for others, which I think is also an important role. And then, and Jenny, we'll probably get back to this later, because immigrants are also more mobile or more willing to move within the country, it means that they are more likely to go to places where there are jobs or there are openings, so at all skill levels, which I think gets beyond just sort of high-skilled labor, but it also helps make the whole economy work better if people are more willing to sort of move to take jobs that are open and to help things.
And so we've been talking a little bit theoretically here, but for all of these things there is evidence. So in fact we find that if you look amongst workers with college or more, that immigrants are twice as likely to patent, for example, as natives are, and that has, then there is one more theoretical step. We do think that that's contributed to growth, probably perhaps up to 2.5% over 10 years, and that's something that then compounds and continues. There is also evidence of exactly what Kim was saying, that firstly, immigrants have to pick a place when they first arrive, and they tend to pick the booming places, the most productive places, and then they're also more mobile within the US even after their initial move than natives are, and that also contributes to the productivity of the economy. So we have evidence for that. As I said, also evidence for the specialization of the natives in more communications and English-intensive jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I find that aspect of the report a very important reminder not to think of our economy as a series of zero-sum games, but that it's something this large and this dynamic. You introduce an element like a number of immigrants, and there's a kind of a leavening, a series of secondary effects into the entire economic picture. So it's not a matter of sort of one immigrant, one native, and trying to judge impacts, but this much richer picture which starts to emerge from this report. We've, as we all know all too well, we've been living now in a prolonged period of modest to slow to negligible growth rates. And there's ongoing concern about whether that's a circumstance that extends forward. Before going forward on the demographic part, which particularly we'll turn to Dal about, in looking at these economic impacts, I'm curious how you judged the effects of that context. How are these dynamics changed by the fact that they played out during a period where the overall economy was had obviously a severe downturn, but then the last 8-9 years of slow recovery? How do we understand those effects and the effect of that context on these dynamics?
Well, that's something that we certainly talked about in the panel, but we realized that there wasn't really evidence on how the context had changed things. So I could speculate, but it's actually not in the report, even though we also thought that was an important question.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, then let's talk about the future then, because one of the important topics, and as you mentioned in your opening remarks, and is the how we think about the future influence of immigration on the economy, and one of the questions which the report addresses that's been a long-term point of discussion in immigration debates is the role of immigration in the Social Security, Medicare, and other policies, an important part of the deficits you mentioned, that are certain to increase in the years to come. So, Dow, you've written a lot about how in the past, and a lot of that's reflected in the report, that immigration flows till now have helped mitigate in part some of the effects of an aging population. What I'm curious about is hearing from the three of you how we think about this going forward. What does this report tell us about the way we should think of the role of immigration in what are certain to be very difficult debates? I mean, we've managed to avoid them for a long time. So, and in Washington, you never know. We could still avoid dealing with the fiscal effects of an aging population for a while longer. But there's going to come a time when this has to be addressed. And this report attempts to give us some ideas about how to think about immigration in that coming debate. Now, I was wondering whether you could address what are some of the important tangents that we see.
Well, Roberto, thank you. As a demographer and a planner, I've looked at the future oftentimes. And the big question is always, when did the future start? Well, it already started. It started in 2000, 2001 to be exact. Seriously, it did start already. And we can't appreciate how it's evolving without looking at what happened recently. Most people's mindsets about what is reality are really about 10 years out of date, sometimes 20 years in California out of date. It's interesting. We don't really update things fast enough. And we've gone through a very volatile period with the boom of the bubble, and then the bust, and the recovery. And now you're asking into the future beyond that. And people's perspectives are just really lagging very much. So let me just quickly recap. There was rapid growth in the 1970s and 80s when the large baby boom generation entered the working ages. Like 20 million people per decade were being added in the workforce. Rapid. And then it started to slow down, but immigrants started to pick up in the 70s and 80s and 90s and filled some of the gap. This current decade we're in right now, that's 2010 to 2020, we're right in the middle of it, 2016. Right here in the middle of this decade, it's a total transition where the working age population is now shrinking down to only 8 million growth. And most of that now is immigrants and their children. Next decade, it's all immigrants and their children. There is really no third generation plus native growth after 2020 because the large baby boomers, the large baby boom generation that came in the 70s and 80s that swelled the labor force is now 40 years later going out the back door and shrinking the labor force as they exit into retirement. It's a massive exit. And there's still 40% of the newcomers in the labor force are still these third generation. But there's not enough of them to offset all the parents and grandparents going out the retirement stage. So what it means is that we're shifting our reliance tremendously to this foreign-born population and their children, who we've fortunately invested in the past, as much as we needed them to invest to have a prosperous retirement, because we can't go back. So I hope we invested well when we were looking at the future back in 2001. Although I have some doubts. But let me just say, in terms of the ratios, there's a simple way of looking at just how dependent we are on the younger generation now that we did invest in, hopefully. It's the senior ratio, or sometimes the dependency ratio. It used to be there was 24 seniors, age 65 and older, per 100 working age people, 24. Currently, it's up to 27. It's rising. And by 2030, it's up to 40 in the U.S. So it's jumping tremendously. And without immigration, the ratio would rise even more, another quarter, 25% greater rise in the ratio. So immigrants have helped to sort of balance our population. They can't stop aging. Unfortunately, nobody can stop aging. But they can slow its increase and keep us a little more balanced. Now, that's the big picture on what's happening going forward. There's specific occupations that have to be filled, Some are high skilled, some are low skilled, but there's a generational support system where we're all intertwined. It's not really, you can't separate the natives from the immigrants, or the immigrants from parents from their children. We're really all intertwined, and there's a 25-year generational rotation that's ongoing, and we need to make that work a little more favorably than it has, because we're becoming so top-heavy now with all these retirees who deserve their retirement. They will claim it, and I will claim it. And I always point out that this large baby boomer bubble that is causing so much trouble, it wasn't our idea. There's nobody's fault. It's just a natural path of events, and we have to make the best of it, and we can. And we're fortunate that we still have immigrants that want to come to join us.
I was just going to add to that, if we sort of go to the fiscal side of this, one thing that is also important to remember is, even though we sort of talk about people paying into Social Security and Medicare, and about people feel like they made their payments in and that's what they're getting out, it's a pay-as-you-go system. So it isn't necessarily the case that Dowell's money is sort of sitting there waiting for him to retire, right? So the money that's going to actually be used to pay off his Social Security is the money that you guys over here, who seem pretty young, are going to pay in, right? So it's basically something that we're in a pay-as-you-go world, and so part of what we're doing is we need people to sort of keep coming, or to be part of the labor force and to sustain employment in order for these things to work. How big or small these issues are and sort of what the fiscal cliffs look like, a lot of that is going to depend on sort of, one, how long existing people as they age continue to work, and two, in addition to sort of what's going on with the population, what we decide as a country on the fiscal side. Like, you know, there are all sorts of conversations that happen that aren't necessarily getting resolved in Washington about sort of how do we fix Social Security and Medicare. If we can slow down the rate of growth in healthcare costs, that would help. If people worked a little bit longer before they retired, that would help. If we actually raised taxes and cut other spending, that would also help. But a lot of this is going to be dependent on sort of having workers be part of that, and immigrants and the children of immigrants are an increasingly large part of that population.
Well, let me just follow on there, because some of the chapters I admire most in the report are the fiscal chapters. And there are just some beautiful graphs in there that look at the second generation who was born in America, grew up here, educated in America, how much more they pay in taxes as they become more educated. Going from a high school degree to a college degree to a postgraduate degree, it's amazing the differences, the increase. And I just know that when I'm trying to sell my house, I hope that some of those better educated people show up on my doorstep, and not the undereducated ones that I couldn't afford to invest in earlier on. We really have to pay forward in order to reap tax benefits going forward in the future. And so if the future already started in 2001, we might be in trouble because we didn't do enough, but we still have chance for the next decade, or the decade ahead, I think, Roberto.
Did you want to weigh in on this?
No, I'm not as good at foreseeing the future as my colleagues on the panel.
No, sorry. I mean, it does. I mean, the way you've just described this, when we go back to the thorny fiscal question of to whom do you ascribe the costs of educating children?
Right.
I mean, do you ascribe it to? I mean, there are two obvious choices: the children or the parents. But the picture you're painting
or
here
society, right.
it really is the people who are going to collect Social Security benefits are the ones who are reaping the benefits of that education, right? So
some of them, right? Yes.
No. Well, yeah. I mean, the notion you know, in this longer term picture where you imagine the second generation, this very large cohort of the children of the 80s and 90s and the aughts becoming important contributors to our fiscal balance out in the 20s and 30s when all this crunch comes. I mean, that's really the payoff for the investment that was put in at the state and local level in their education, right?
Right, and there's some mismatch with that, right? If you feel like the federal government is getting a lot of the benefit, but states are paying for it, but that's a whole other area. And part of the reason the report is 500 pages is we look at these questions like, who do you attribute the cost of education to? How do you make assumptions about sort of when you're looking forward, what we're gonna do in terms of balancing the budget? And part of the reason it's 500 pages is that we have a plethora of economists, and so our answer to most of these questions was, we'll do it both ways. And so you'll see things where we look at things on an average cost, where we basically attribute things to everybody. And then we'll do things where we'll look at sort of, well, is it really fair to say that immigrants who are coming in should be paying out past debts or the cost of defense, right? There are things called public goods that we generally think don't actually, the cost of which don't increase if you add another person to it. And so part of what we do in the fiscal section of the report, which we actually did new work in, is we looked at things on an average basis and then also on a marginal basis. And not surprisingly, if you don't attribute things like defense to immigrants, they're actually very attractive, and they help make the fact that we have these big deficits more affordable for the rest of us.
Oh,
Is that
well, that's good.
in my green eye shade way?
Well, let me go to the other thing you said, though. You also said that we have new immigrants arriving, but we also have immigrants who are already here, and there's two ways to calculate the cost. When we go forward in the future, do we use a profile of the typical new immigrant to be like people who are already here, or do we use a profile that's based on those who've arrived just recently in the last 5 years? And if you wanted to make immigrants look worse, you would use the old immigrants as a profile, who are less educated. And if you want to make immigrants look like a better fiscal bargain, then you would use the new. So some people prefer to use the old. But the facts are, and we show this clearly in the report, is that education has been rising steadily since 1970 for immigrant arrivals. Each decade, steadily higher, higher, higher. And so how could you go back and use the old when really the new is even probably an underestimate for future educational attainment of new arrivals? I just point it out because that is in the news today, I think also. People are using old immigrants to represent the future, and it's not consistent with current trends.
And in the report, we do both, right? So basically in the report on the fiscal side, we do a number of things. The first thing we do is we do year by year sort of accounting of sort of what these things look like for the first, second, and third plus generation, both controlling for the age profile and also looking at sort of whether things are more or less recent. And then we also do something where we do a 75-year projection going forward, where we basically look at if you have an additional immigrant coming, what are the taxes paid and services received of them and their children. And so like their children and maybe their grandchildren 75 years in the future, where we're basically adding this up. And in general, their immigrants look really good. That's sort of where you basically get both the amount of money you're investing, but also that return from those kids in the allocation to that immigrant when they first arrive. And then we also do stuff state by state for the state and local work, just sort of showing how that varies across different places.
Yeah, I just want to underscore what might seem like a methodological or accounting issue, which is the measurement of impact at 75 years rather than in a shorter time frame. I mean, the nature of immigration is such that you don't know the actual effects on a society until the second generation reaches adulthood. And this is a confounding factor in any discussion of immigration. The image I draw is if we had been sitting here 100 years ago in 1916, the conversation about the impact of the European immigrants who had arrived in the previous 10 years would have been extraordinarily dire about their absolute inability to work in an industrial economy. They were unfit to be citizens of a democracy. They were producing crime, illness, and who knows what else. Less than 75 years later, 50 years later, That generation had conquered the world, had brought about the American century, had defeated authoritarianism in Europe and Asia, and was confronting communism on the world stage. And so if you take a short-term view, particularly if you take a very narrow contemporary view, you lose sight of this. And this report, when it casts its eye out in these 75 years projections, you see an entirely different set of assumptions. There's one other, one other housekeeping detail, large conceptual housekeeping detail. If I'm not mistaken, this report says in assessing fiscal impacts, correct me if I'm wrong, that similarly situated natives and foreign-born have the same fiscal impacts. Is that correct? That there's nothing about being foreign-born per se.
So what we do is we attribute costs and benefits, and I really should have a green eye shade right now, to individuals. So we do this in a number of ways. We start with individual information we have about people. So if you're receiving certain benefits or you're paying specific taxes, we sort of attribute that to you. What we find, even though there are certain costs that immigrants have, like for example, the cost of like bilingual education or programs for immigrant children, we attribute to those children. But in general, most of the costs, and when we average most things in, the costs and benefits of immigrants and natives are largely being driven by a few factors, one of which is sort of their education and their income levels. So the education of the immigrants themselves, their income, and their age. So that sort of gets, and the number of kids they have. So what we find is that the people who are most expensive are those people that have kids. So the fact that immigrants look more expensive has much more to do with the fact that they are younger and they have kids, and less to do with the fact that they are foreign-born. And that's where this whole question about whether we're sort of looking at them as investments or not. The other thing to note is if you look at an individual, whether they're foreign-born or native, you see definite costs and payments in over a life cycle or over sort of a 90-year period. So if you start off, you find that someone comes or is born, they're really expensive sort of when they hit age 5 and we're sending them to school. And so basically state and local governments are paying for education.
Right.
They're sort of in school till they're either 17 or 21. And they're expensive. They start paying taxes when they're 21 or so. You're getting a big benefit as people are paying taxes and they're not necessarily using services themselves. And so you sort of have this picture where they're above the line. And then we hit 65 or 70 where the costs to the government are higher again because they're receiving Social Security and their health care costs go up. And so basically anybody, if you look at an individual person and you look at sort of how they interact with government, you see that they get money at the beginning and they get money at the end, and in the middle they're paying in, hopefully to cover those costs and to make the whole system work.
Right, so children and old people are annoying because they cost money. But the important thing here, and I want to go back to this point, that if you, a couple that has 3 children and sends them to public school is producing the same costs.
Pretty much,
regardless of their nativity.
Yes.
Okay.
But there's one big difference, though. Same costs, but the payoff on the back end when the kids grow up, for some reason, is higher for the immigrants' children than for the children of native-born. The second generation, on all the studies, all the graphs, we show this higher payoff, and it's not totally clear why.
I think part of this has to do with they get a little bit more education, and they probably are specializing in things that might have a little bit more payoff. Anecdotally, so not looking at the data, this is sort of like, you have the kids of immigrants who are becoming doctors and lawyers or scientists and stuff, and aren't necessarily going to be as likely to become ethnomusicologists.
So, we started out.
Nothing against ethnomusicologists.
Yeah, right. So we started out thinking about the economy as a big complex system rather than sort of a series of zero-sum games. And we've talked now about the need to look at a long arc. Having put down those two big markers, now let's turn to the contentious issue of the day, which is much more the short-term effects of low-skilled immigrants. Jenny, where you were going to take us initially. This report adds significantly to a nuanced understanding of the interactions between those workers and other similarly situated workers and the economies in which they exist. And I was wondering whether you could just give us the high points of that analysis.
Well, firstly, since both you and apparently the Washington Times mentioned the short run, one of the things we talk about in the report is we don't really know what the short run is in practice. In theory, we know, but in practice, we don't know. So the short run would be you suddenly have a huge wave of people come in a few months, and there isn't really time for much to adjust in the economy. But we rarely see that in the US. There's more like steady but steadily increasing flows. And interestingly, even our theoretical models have not really dealt with the case of, well, how do firms change their behavior knowing that immigration is coming and is gradually increasing? So surprisingly, we don't actually have a good theoretical model for that. So now overall, firstly, I should say that we don't actually find, we in the report and the authors that we cite in the report, that there's really any effect on the employment rate of natives from immigration. That's a bit different actually from other countries, but for the US, really no one in this literature is concerned about employment rates of natives. And so the whole question revolves around what is the effect on wages. And just like the previous report, actually, we find that on average, the effect on native wages is actually about 0. And then the question is, what's the more nuanced picture? And so theoretically speaking, we expect immigration to benefit natives overall, including business owners, workers. And then we expect there to be, however, winners and losers, and that's true within workers as well. And who the winners and losers are depends on the makeup of the immigration flows. So it depends, so it's a bit complicated because, as Kim said, the immigrants are concentrated at the top and the bottom. And so normally the losers are going to be people, native workers who see inflows of people just like them. So in theory, you would expect it to be the natives at the very top and the very bottom who are hurt. But at the top, as I mentioned before, though, there's this issue that there could be a completely different thing going on, that you actually helped, that your productivity is increased by having people to work with, that you're actually complementary and not substitutes. So for that reason, and also for reasons of equity, we're most concerned about, say, native high school dropouts, who are about 10% of the population. And what we did agree in the report is it does seem as though they are people whose wages are decreased by immigration. However, what we could not agree on was a number. And so we came to a consensus about the sign, not about the number. And in fact, there's a big range of studies that range from very small negative effect to actually quite big negative effect. And we did not take the step of saying, well, there was this or that flaw in the one that found the small or the big effect. We couldn't actually get consensus on that. So we agree there is a group of natives at the bottom who experience a negative effect. We don't know exactly how large.
So, Roberto, can I just push back on Jenny on this point a little bit? It's not in the report, I know. But so it's a very small effect on natives. And yet incomes aren't doing very well for the natives. Somebody has to be blamed for that. Something or somebody. What is it that's, what else could be causing the fact that incomes have stagnated the way they have until just recently?
Well, now you could write a whole other National Research Council
but
report.
And I'm guessing they have.
But the public really wants to know this.
No, that's a very good point. So this, I think actually there might be a sentence or two on it in the report. You're exactly right, the wages of the less skilled in the US men in particular have been falling, not falling quite to the level of female wages, but and the main explanatory factors that people have in mind for that are technological change, offshoring, so moving production of
Right.
actually especially of less skilled tasks abroad, and then perhaps a little bit, but I don't think anyone thinks immigration, even the studies that find the big negative effect, even that is not enough to explain much of this phenomenon. So correct in sign, but not in magnitude for immigration. And then there's currently actually a bit of an argument after a long time of thinking that trade in goods was not important. That's more of an open question now. But those are really the big factors. No one really thinks, this is such a big phenomenon, no one thinks that immigration is a big contributor to that. But
Okay.
that's an excellent point.
But this also gets back to the fact that returns to education are increasing overall in the country. And so when we're talking about this, especially when we're talking about natives with less than a high school education, that's becoming an increasingly small group of people as more and more people are graduating from high school. And so you basically find that you have to sort of understand sort of who it is we're talking about, and so how you sort of think about it. Are we talking about the 50 or 60-year-old person without a high school degree who probably spent his life in the factory and, was actually earning a pretty good wage? Or are we talking about the 18 to 20-year-old African American who just basically dropped out of school and is having a tough time? And so part of this is also trying to understand some of who these people are who were left in specific groups and why we think there might be different effects. So one of the other things that were found in the report that's highlighted is there does seem to be a small negative effect on the hours, not necessarily the employment, of teenagers, of immigration. And part of that, you could imagine, has to do with the fact that if newly arrived immigrants and people who are teenagers or young are going into the workforce, you could imagine that there are limited numbers of entry-level jobs. And so there's some of that happening. Is that fair?
Well, I wouldn't say there's a limited number, but there are
Okay.
competition, and
Yes, sorry.
and that might affect the wages, and that in turn might affect how many hours the teenagers want to work.
So let me, one last topic before we turn to the audience. So we've talked about effects among highly skilled workers in the entrepreneurial economy and low skilled workers. How do we understand the effects in the middle? Where the report talks, they're because of the hourglass shape of the immigration flows, they're not as direct, but there are certainly some effects. Jenny?
Right. So I don't think that we have really good, purely empirical studies looking at this. We have studies that are somewhat of a blend of theory and data looking at this. But those studies say that precisely because there are not many immigrants coming in with middle skills, and because the people in the middle might be complementary, they work with the people at the top and the bottom rather than competing with them, they suggest that at least relatively speaking, immigration benefits middle skill natives compared to the high and low skill natives, or at least certainly again compared to the low. The high, it looks like perhaps that there's some evidence it's not as solid as some other, but that they may even benefit also from immigration. So the middle and the higher skilled probably are benefiting. The lower skilled are probably being hurt.
Yeah, I want to explore a little bit about those benefits. Can we say a little bit more about what they constitute? How somebody in the middle might not perceive it directly, but where in their checkbook accounts they would see the effects.
Well, an example would be, often we take construction, and we talk about...
We'll go back to you. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Now, you can go first.
Well, we talk about, say, construction, so that's a classic. There's a lot of inflows of of people from Mexico, Central America into the lower level construction jobs. But there are people who are the supervisors of those people. And so if they actually do reduce the wages of the natives at the bottom, there will be a bigger demand for construction services because they're cheaper, and that will increase the demand for more likely the natives who are the supervisors, and their wages will go up.
So I was just going to say that part of this, and part of the reason I seem to be sort of more on these messages than others, is I spent all of yesterday doing some of this with the National Academy directly, so went through the slides that we have. So partly, if you go beyond employment and wages, there are other ways that for, that whole middle section benefit from immigrants being in the country, right? So what Jenny said in terms of housing costs or construction is probably less. Those costs are less because we have immigrants acting as construction workers. In certain regions, in the Midwest especially, where they're losing population, the fact that you want to sell your house, the fact that there are immigrants coming in is probably the main thing propping up those house prices. There are also all sorts of service industries that are helping make the economy run and the country run. If we think about sort of where immigrants are working in terms of, working as domestic help within the house, healthcare aides, nannies, right? There are all sorts of direct effects that everybody, even if you're not working with somebody in your job who is an immigrant, they might be affecting your life and sort of helping things run smoother.
On the consumer side.
On the consumer side, exactly.
Yeah, and certainly what you're seeing, many prices.
Yes.
I mean, that's where people in the middle will obviously notably see the impact is on what they pay for all kinds of goods and services, housing, a variety of other factors.
And there are certain industries and certain occupations that are predominantly staffed with immigrants, and often these low-skilled immigrants that people don't necessarily want to do those jobs. A colleague of mine was at a hearing yesterday on long-term care. And if you think about the people who are working in long-term care facilities, a disproportionate number of them are not very well paid, often recent immigrants who are doing sort of some of the thankless work that we really need to do, and that's going to become increasingly important as people age and we, as a society.
Good. So let's turn to the audience for a little more than 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back to the panel for some closing thoughts. So I think there's a microphone, is that right? There's a microphone. Raise your hands, please let us know who you are. I think this gentleman in the front was right off the mark.
Alejandro Becerra. Your study report seems to confirm previous studies showing that the effects on wages tend to affect native-borns without a high school education. In addition to that, you say that it also affects prior immigrants. Does that help explain why there may be a few anti-immigrant sentiment by these prior immigrants?
Actually, I'm often surprised that there isn't more anti-immigrant sentiment in the US amongst immigrants, but I think actually over time and place it's quite common. All immigrants think that they and all prior immigrants were fantastic, but everyone who came after them was somehow not so good, and I think it's for exactly this reason. I think you're right.
Yes. Can we get the microphone over here? You are?
Jack Martin. The importance of this study, it seems to me, is that it provides information with regard to decision making, which is important because of the fact that immigration is a discretionary policy. It's not written in stone. So when you find in the study that there are disparate effects with regard to who it is coming in, particularly low educational level, low wage workers having a more negative effect with regard to the fiscal consequences, that would seem to inform the fact that there's a valid debate with regard to how many of those lower educational level non-English speaking people come into the country because it has more of a negative fiscal effect. But the other issues really have to do with how many you're talking about. And as I understand it, the results of the study suggest that the more the better in terms of the economic advantage of a large number of immigrants coming into the country. But doesn't that ignore the fact that there are other outside factors such as crowding and impact on the environment and so on, which I assume are not taken into consideration at all in this report?
So we don't make any policy recommendations in the report. If you go to chapter 10 and you're looking sort of for, after we spent these 3 years doing this, what we think sort of optimal policy for immigration would be, you'll be a little disappointed. Partly, we were tasked with sort of laying out information and helping inform people to make those decisions. We make recommendations, but they're mainly about the need for better data. And which is, I shouldn't make light of it. It would actually be incredibly useful to us to know more information about sort of who that second generation is. But I think a lot of what you're saying is valid, and I think those are interesting questions and policy debates we should be having as a country, sort of about whether and how we'd want to change immigration policy and if there is some level, but we don't really get into those things. I don't know if you guys have.
I do want to follow up a little bit. So the one key thing to know is that the benefit of immigration comes from the immigrants being different from the natives, at least if you put aside the innovation and the spillover questions, issues. So if we had an inflow of immigrants to the US where basically a twin of every person already in the US came in, you would actually expect that in the end it would just be a bigger US with everything the same, otherwise same wages, same prices, because the benefit comes when the immigrants are different and that it allows this greater specialization. So one of the advantages of having lower skilled immigrants than there are natives is allowing this greater specialization and some of these things that Kim was talking about, in some cases offering services that you actually don't even get in Europe because the immigrants are not sufficiently low skill that these services are actually offered. So that's one almost impossible to measure benefit of the low skilled immigrants. So you need to add that. You need to add the fiscal side.
Right, so the demographic differences are actually sort of driving a lot of when we talk about the fact that having immigrants coming in.
Well, I mean, but the point is that the report doesn't offer these policy prescriptions. Yeah. It's a 500-page report put on the table as a buffet for you to choose from and for us to argue about later, because it really does feed a lot of ideas.
Right, but just to finish, you need to add the specialization, the fiscal, and the lowering the native wages all together when you make your decision. There are those three things about low-skilled immigrants.
Immigration policy is a balancing act. You have to balance all these objectives. And I think we added some more data here and more insights to put into the balancing equation.
Any other question? Yes.
Good morning, Amanda Berkson-Chilcock from the National Skills Coalition. Thank you so much. My question has to do with the difference between the national economic picture and the state and local economic picture. So as researchers, and this is clearly a very evidence-based report, what data do you think is in the report that would be of most interest to a state-level policymaker who's trying to evaluate issues at the state level rather than this sort of 30,000-foot national level of these issues?
Chapter 9, which I did a lot of the work on, but basically what we do and what is different than what was done before, and partly because I thought it was really important for us to do, is in that chapter we actually break out sort of the fiscal costs and benefits for state and local governments, state by state. And so a lot of this comes down to both the characteristics of the different populations, so the different groups, and also the decisions that states are making in terms of the level of spending on education and the tax systems they have in place. And so, but if you're a state, budget person, or if you're just, a state legislator, they're going to basically go to that chapter and look at sort of what things look like in California versus Texas. And so part of that is to sort of break out how much this varies. And the thing that I hope they take away from this, because we do find in general that immigrants cost more than they contribute, is that second generation, where we're actually seeing this return even to many states. The problem is because people are mobile, and because state tax systems are less progressive and less based on income, it means that the returns aren't necessarily as clear for the states that have to make that investment in education for what benefits the country as a whole. But for state folks, I think there's going to be a lot of delving over those tables, and hope it helps.
We have time for one last question. Yes, you're straining there.
Challenges of being diminutive. Hi, Heather Stewart from NAFSA, the Association of International Educators. I want to speak to higher education and international students. Can you speak to the spillover effect of international students on campuses in the U.S. and also to, after they graduate, some portion of them would like to remain and work in the United States. What effects does that have on our economy and our communities? Thank you.
Jenny?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and there's only a little bit in the report on that, which I think reflects partly that the literature is not quite as big as you would think. And so I'm trying to think, we did have a couple of papers in there that we discussed that look at how the choice of field of natives is affected by the arrival of the immigrants, but that's only a little part of your question. So I think actually we can talk after, and I can tell you a bit more about what I think we know that's not in the report, but we don't actually have a very good understanding, and there's only there's very limited amount in the report.
It's kind of amazing, given it's a 500-page report, how much is not necessarily in there. That keeps coming up.
Yes.
You now have approximately a minute and a half each for a bon mot that summarizes the 500 words. What is the takeaway here?
Am I going?
Or what do you want to add? Well, let's
Okay.
go across this way. Maybe you'll have the last word.
Okay, well, so one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, I do, when I talk about these things, stress what the impact on natives is, because I find that that's what natives are most interested in, but we haven't mentioned that immigration is very, very beneficial to immigrants. And one thing that we have in the paper, it's a very crude calculation, extremely crude, but we calculate that the size of the economy of GDP, it's about 11% larger because of immigration. And that's in itself something some people are interested in, just the size, not per capita or not natives, just how big it is. Most of that benefit does actually go to the immigrants, but chalk that up as a good thing. So to summarize, what we show in the paper is that, as we would expect theoretically, but we find empirically, immigration raises the income of natives as well as the immigrants, but there are winners and losers amongst the natives. On average, no effect on the wages of natives, no effect on the employment of natives, but some negative impact on the, as Kim stressed, the small group by now of very unskilled natives. And yes, I'll leave it at that.
I would just conclude with like two broad points. One being that we cannot evaluate immigration in a static way at a moment in time. It's impossible because the investments or the costs of immigrants are at one point in time and the payoffs are later. If we don't look over time, we're not able to make any decision at all that's at all reasonable. And at the same time, the native-born population over time is also evolving. We're all evolving through time, and the aging of the baby boomers in particular will be the dominant factor for the next 20 years, impacting the fiscal state of America. And so that's just inescapable. Fortunately, children grow up, and children become the new the new taxpayers and the new workers and new home buyers. So we have to keep both those things looking forward in time. I'll stop there.
And I think we've covered a lot of what I think is important in the report. I think Dowell's points about the fiscal stuff is really important. One of the things that we do cover that we didn't really get into as much is the fact that immigrants are actually moving into a larger set of communities, and so there's more geographic dispersion, and I think that's sort of an issue that, you know, warrants more study. So I'd like to think, rather than this being the last word on these topics, it's sort of an opening way of sort of putting some information out there that we can then build on and sort of expand what we know and what we need to know about the topic.
No, absolutely. As I said at the onset, this report it opens a chapter of study and debate that's going to it'll take a long time to digest, add to, and expand on, much the way New Americans produced volumes following it. This really seeds our study. And if there's a really, really simple bottom line to this, is it's not simple. And be wary of anybody on any side of the argument who tries to convince you that it's simple. Thank you.
That was just terrific. So as we're bringing this panel off, and we're going to move the next one on directly, and if you need to stretch your legs, let me encourage you to do that in place if we can, because we're going to go straight. So we will have our panel mic'd in just about 15 more seconds, and we'll move right ahead. And are we good to go? All right. Thank you, Audrey.
Welcome to the panel that takes us to the starting point, the NAS findings and study, and brings it down to the state and local level. I'm Audrey Singer. I'm a senior fellow in the Metropolitan Communities and Housing Policy Center here at the Urban Institute, and we're really delighted to have all of you in the room with us, and those of you who are watching on the webcast, welcome as well. Before I introduce our panelists, I just want to say a word about the picture that we have behind us. When I saw that picture, I emailed Kim Rubin asking her if that was two members of the study panel when they received the final report, jumping for joy. And she wrote back saying, no, there would be 500 pages in a book in her hand, not just one page. So this is a naturalization ceremony with a certificate, I believe. So we're really excited today to have a stellar set of speakers from several communities around the country. Next to me is Renata Soto. She's the co-founder and executive director of Conexión Americas in Nashville, which has one of the nation's fastest growing immigrant populations among all metropolitan areas. Conexión is a nonprofit that serves primarily Latino families in the Nashville area with programs to support immigrants in buying a home, starting a business, learning English, supporting the educational success of children, and otherwise helping immigrants integrate into Nashville. Next to her is Sonia Lin. She is General Counsel and Policy Director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs. And MOIA is an agency that works to ensure the well-being of immigrant communities and supports their economic, social, and civic integration. And there are numerous programs and policies. I'm going to ask her to talk about those in a bit. But Sonia, her main responsibilities, she leads programs that promote access to justice by connecting the immigrants to free and safe immigration legal services and also citizenship support. And they do that in a variety of ways, often through trusted community-based organizations and libraries across the city. Senator Moises Dennis, also known as Mo, is a state senator from Nevada. I should say Nevada. I've spent some time there. I know better. But I'm from the East Coast. He's been a member of the legislature since 2011. Mo is also the co-chair of the National Conference of State Legislatures Task Force on Immigration. He works with other state senators from around the country to focus attention on state-level concerns around immigration issues and to help NCSL influence policy and legislation at the national level on a range of issues. I really want to congratulate NAS and the study panel experts for this report. It says a lot about a lot of things, as we've just heard. And it's much harder to characterize things at the state and local level and the lived experiences of immigrants and the communities in which they live and work and go to school and worship and shop in. Of course, we're going to use that as a frame to have a much fuller discussion about what it's like in various communities around the country. And I should point out that, of course, immigrants are not evenly distributed around communities in the country, but their costs and their contributions also really vary widely across places. Neither are there investments in immigrant communities made by municipal governments, by states, and by nonprofit organizations. And housing markets, labor markets, and the opportunities that they offer also vary widely. And different places attract different kinds of immigrants. And so that's the kind of thing that we're going to be talking about here today. While the federal government is responsible for creating national laws and policies around immigration, most of the policies and the programs and the practices that affect immigrants and their families are operating at the city and the county and the state level. So it's the Nashvilles and the New Yorks and the Nevadas and the Las Vegases that are the places that face the practicalities of integrating immigrants. They and other places around the country have choices in how to invest in immigrants and their children, and they do so in varying degrees. So some places, especially those with a long history and identity as immigrant gateways, have been involved in the integration of immigrants into social, political, and economic fabric of those places. They are more likely to have well-developed organizations that reach out to immigrants. Often they have nonprofits and community-based organizations that have been started by immigrant newcomers that carry on this non-governmental role of being in between immigrants and the institutions and the communities in which they're integrating into. Other places where immigration is a newer phenomenon, shall we say, are somewhat less excited about immigrant newcomers coming into their midst. And often places over time have developed policies that serve to deflect or exclude immigrants, often aimed at those who are undocumented. But as we know, the undocumented and legal immigrants and US citizens are all wrapped up sometimes in the same families and households, and certainly in the same communities, so those policies tend to affect a larger group of people. So I'm going to start with Renata. Nashville is currently the home of about 150,000 immigrants. It's doubled in size since 2000, and immigrants now make up about 8% of the population. And I'd like to talk to you about Conexión a bit. Tell us a bit about the organization, its work, and its goals, and what kinds of issues moved you to start the organization.
Well, it's great to be here. Well, I would say I'm one of the 40 million in the report. I came to the US when I was 21 with the opportunity to finish college and stayed here because of marriage. Nashville is one of the many places that you describe where many Nashvillians did not know someone that spoke a foreign language or they came from somewhere else in a very clear and tangible way up until 25 years ago. And Conexión Americas is exactly a response to not only the growth of Latino families who were coming to places like Nashville or Atlanta, Georgia, or Charlotte, North Carolina, or Dalton, Georgia too, but also a response to recognize that as those families are looking to become part of the community and start a business and buy a house and pursue their American dream, that also the Nashville community was grasping a change that some welcome more than others. And the birth of Conexión Americas is precisely to respond to be both a support network for those families that are arriving and also a place to have conversations with native Nashvillians about why in the first place Mexicans come to Nashville, why are Central Americans arriving, what are the conditions that we leave behind, and what are the challenges and opportunities that we're seeking in our new community. We have been around now 14 years, and our focus has been promoting the social, economic, and civic integration of those families, understood as a two-way street where the immigrants are trying to learn the new language, a new system, new customs, but also where deliberately we're understanding that Nashvillians also have to adapt in reciprocal ways, and that we are a more diverse community, but that Nashville will be only inclusive if we take deliberate steps to make sure that those immigrants have opportunities and tools to succeed, and that Nashville as a whole will reap the benefits of their contributions. We are an organization that at a very basic level, to break it down, help families buy houses by accessing financial products that meet their needs. We help entrepreneurs pursue an idea and turn it into a successful business, including a culinary incubator that pretty much highlights the conversation in the earlier panel of people that are coming with family recipes and with amazing creativity and skills and are turning that into successful businesses, food trucks, catering companies, wholesalers, and are creating jobs for others, not just for themselves. And we are also very invested in the point of making sure that that second generation is also fulfilling what the report says, primarily focusing on ensuring that the children of immigrants or immigrant kids who are already a growing percentage of our school system in Nashville have the opportunity to succeed in high school and become the first in their families to graduate from high school and go to college through a national program developed by the National Council of La Raza. We're one of 20 organizations across the country who implement that. And I'll talk more about how that connects to what we heard in the report, but certainly we understand that immigrants are not just workers who want a good job, but they're people full of aspirations and needs and assets and dreams, and we try to be a support at every point of their life in Nashville, and hoping that we're also a voice for bringing Nashvillians and immigrants together to understand how our presence benefits our city.
Well, if you'd like to say something about the second generation, I think it's of great interest. Certainly in the report, it spends a lot of time talking about not just the short-term, but the long-term benefits of this population. And I don't know if you can elaborate on how the second generation is doing as they become adults, as they enter the workforce. Are they staying in Nashville? What's going on around that?
So Nashville is a, even in our 14-year history, we already can see the change of our community. 14 years ago, when we started Conexión Americas, we were mostly exclusively thinking about the resources, tools, aspirations, challenges, and assets of the first arriving parent. Usually the dad who came to Nashville for a construction job when Nashville was in the middle of a construction boom, building a stadium for football and an arena and other big infrastructure investments. I love to hear the story from a priest in our community in the neighborhood where we are located that says how in the early 1990s, his church changed by the number of single men that showed up to church. And then 3 years later, his church changed again because those men now are bringing their wives and kids who they had sent home now that Nashville became a place where they saw a future and a place to call home permanently. So in that same way, at Conexión Americas, we see not only those adults who are the first arriving, learning English, being employed in service industry, hospitality, tourism is very important industry in Nashville, and certainly the immigrant workforce is propelling the vitality of industry in big ways. But then also we started seeing the shift of our school systems, and actually for us it's more important to see what the school system is looking like than what the census tell us about how many immigrants are in our community, because that's like the more real snapshot about what's happening in Nashville. Already 25% of our children in kindergarten are Latino, and 30% of the students in Nashville come from homes where English is not the primary language. And that continues to grow every year. We have a system of about almost 90,000 children. And so what we see now is both the children that came with their parents as immigrants, but also the children who are being born in Nashville, who are already in kindergarten and now graduating from high school. And a few years ago, precisely recognizing that change and in the clamor from parents to also have resources to help their kids succeed in school, is that we brought the NCLR program to Nashville, Escalera, which is an intense after-school program to help them succeed. And what I can tell you is that we are in front of that American dream of the parents who might be employed at what you call low-skilled jobs, although I would argue that many people in this room could not build some of the brick, beautiful walls and things that we see around, and I find it very, very skillful. But certainly their children are this group of people that have not only this expectation from their parents, but this eagerness to make sure that they will be the ones in their family who will change a trajectory, who will make it to college. And that is great, and we are trying to make sure that they have the supports to do that. However, we are also competing with our own self-interest in Tennessee in that, and in many places in the country. Many of these kids who are undocumented are not seen as the Tennesseans who they are, and therefore for them college is more expensive, having to pay sometimes 3 times the amount of money that it would cost to a Tennessee student. And so while our state and our governor is pushing a plan that is called Drive to 55, meaning that in the next 20 years, Tennessee will achieve that mark where at least 55% of our citizens will have graduated from high school and have some kind of post-secondary education, because only 25% of Tennesseans do now, because we understand the economic investment that having a more educated workforce will mean to our economy in Tennessee. So in one hand, our governor and our system is pushing that we reach 55%, everybody, let's get a secondary education somewhere. But on the other hand, we have about 14,000 students in Tennessee who would benefit from in-state tuition rates that are already saying, I want to go to college, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a teacher, I want to be an engineer, but we're making their work harder, and we're making that path more expensive, and sometimes we're easily tempting them to go to another route in which they will not pursue further education. And so we see what the report says in 2 ways, right? Like the energy of those kids, what is propelling them, and the parents that are propelling them to achieve that, the eagerness to become the first in their families to go to college, to break that and achieve an educational level that many of their parents who had 4th, 6th grade education do not have. but yet in our state we're still grasping this sort of reverse policy that is against our interests when we're not making that more possible for these 14,000 kids and others behind them.
Thank you. So New York, well, everybody knows New York is the place with the largest number of immigrants in the United States. It has a long history of receiving immigrants, has the Statue of Liberty. There are nearly 6 million foreign-born people in the metropolitan area there, which is a huge metropolitan area, but more than half of them live in the city of New York. And as a place with its history, as a continuous place of settlement, sets it apart from many other places. So New York is really ahead of things in a lot of ways, and it's kind of unfair to other places, but they are able to present options and opportunities that other places can't. And so what I'm interested in hearing from Sonia about is how a municipal level infrastructure works, how the city government works and invests in these communities and their interactions, not only with immigrant communities, but with the nonprofit sector, various other city agencies, and what it's like to be in a place with a well-developed, well-funded infrastructure to support immigrants. So talk to us about what you guys do at Moya and why the city invests so much.
Great. Thanks, Audrey. And thank you all for coming here today. Thank you so much to the Urban Institute for hosting this really important conversation. I'm really excited to keep talking about these issues and to really dive into the report in the days and months to come. At Moya in New York City, as Audrey mentioned, we have this broad mandate, which I think is a fantastic one, which is to promote the well-being of New York City immigrants and support their social, civic, economic integration. We at Moya are a unit. We're in the city charter. We're within the mayor's office. We recommend policies to pursue our mandate. We conduct outreach throughout the city and immigrant communities in the 5 boroughs, and we help immigrants navigate the city government, New York City generally. And under the leadership of Mayor de Blasio and our commissioner, Nisha Agarwal, we've really focused on a few particular strategies at Moya in this administration. One, to really realize a vision that we have of inclusive government, an equitable city, a government for all New Yorkers, including the 3 million foreign-born New Yorkers, and make sure that these immigrant New Yorkers have access to city services and resources in order to pursue their dreams, fulfill their potential. Another focus that we have, as Audrey mentioned, is supporting immigrants in accessing justice. For us, that means making sure that we can connect people to immigration legal services, support them on their path to citizenship. We've done some research with the Urban Institute actually that shows the sort of economic benefits of naturalization for immigrants, a rise in wages, in employment rates. It's good for immigrants, it's good for their families, it's good for us in the city as well. And so access to justice is a big deal for us. And then advocacy on behalf of New York City immigrants at the local, state, and federal levels. And in doing this work, we work with a really broad range of people. We're a small unit within the mayor's office. It's not our job to serve all New York City immigrants. We do it in partnership with our sister agencies throughout the New York City government, with the really rich and broad kind of community of community-based organizations in New York, faith, labor, business. We work with all kinds of stakeholders and partners who see the benefit in supporting New York City immigrants. And then I think another sort of key to our success is thinking about testing innovative policies and programs, new approaches for delivering services, connecting to immigrants. I think probably the best known program that we've launched in this administration is the ID NYC program. It's New York City's municipal ID card, which was launched at the beginning of 2015. So less than 2 years later, 1 in 10 New Yorkers has a municipal ID card. It's just been tremendously successful, and I'm happy to talk about it more, but I think it's been a really great learning experience for us in the partnerships and collaborations that need to happen, and kind of how to design programs so that they're useful and beneficial to immigrant New Yorkers and to all New Yorkers. I think we've learned that that's a real necessary ingredient for program success.
So from what I know, it sounds like the NYC ID is one of those kinds of things that benefits not just immigrants that didn't come out of your office, right? Or did it come out of your office?
We were definitely one
We're
of
pushing?
the agencies involved. Yeah.
Right. So the idea is that if you have one of these IDs, that you have access to a bunch of things, and it provides city agencies and other organizations ID. But I guess you've got 1 in 10 now. Do you have a sense of how well people are using this? What share are immigrants or foreign-born people? What they're using it to access? And I guess I again want to stress, New York really is a laboratory for other places, and because they're a little bit ahead in terms of how they view immigrants and the money that they have to spend on them, these are lessons for other places. There are many other places around the country, cities in particular, that have municipal IDs and have had them for a while. And so we're learning a lot about how populations use them, but I wonder if you can tell us more about New Yorkers who
Yeah,
have them.
absolutely. And definitely, we were not the first city to create a municipal ID program. New Haven, San Francisco, other cities had these programs, and we are talking to sort of jurisdictions all the time that are interested in starting municipal ID programs. In New York, I think, sort of to answer one of your questions, Audrey, about how are people using the ID, what benefit does it have to them? We actually did a study with a third-party evaluation firm that came out last month, really to dive into this question of, is it working? Do people like it? What are they using it for? Are immigrants actually using it? Definitely immigrant New Yorkers were a key population that we had in mind in designing and implementing the program. They were not the only population by any means. This is a card for all New Yorkers, and we wanted it to be broadly appealing in scope because we did not want it to be a card that stigmatized cardholders. We wanted it to really be something that signaled kind of the most precious identity of all, which is that of being a New Yorker. I don't know, in my opinion. And the evaluation was really interesting. We confirmed that the card is popular throughout the city. So we have cardholders in all zip codes across all 5 boroughs. Definitely higher rates of enrollment in immigrant-dense neighborhoods and populations. We don't ask about immigration status, by the way, so we don't know, who's undocumented, who's documented, people's citizenship status. It is really, do we know who you are? Do we know that you live in New York City? Those are the questions that we ask when people enroll. Other things that we learned in the study are that, of the immigrants who have the card, who self-identified as immigrants, responded to the survey, about 66% use it as their primary ID. About 36% have it as their only form of US-based ID. And that people use it for all sorts of things. And it's kind of using it exactly as we had hoped for very kind of quotidian things like entering city buildings, going to pick up their kids at school when oftentimes you need to show ID.
using it to open a bank or a credit union account with a participating financial institution. Using it, when we were designing the program, we worked with a wide range of cultural institutions throughout New York City who agreed, who were really excited actually about offering free one-year memberships to their institutions for card holders. And that's been a really popular benefit for the card, and I think has drawn a really diverse cross-section of New Yorkers to the program. They're using it. The museums and the concert halls and the other cultural institutions are really thrilled to see kind of new populations come through their doors and enjoy what they have to offer. We just announced new benefits this week, where New York Roadrunners, which is a sort of recreational racing club, running club, has offered memberships to cardholders, and sporting goods stores offering discounts. You can get prescription discounts. So there's a lot. It's like kind of a key to the city for New Yorkers. It's in their wallet. You can use it and sort of enjoy everything that the city has to offer. And then what I think is kind of the most powerful statistic that came from the evaluation was the really high rate, I think over 70% of respondents to the survey who talked about how having the New York City ID increased their sense of belonging in the city, and really did kind of confirm their status as a New Yorker, which I think says a lot about the power that this kind of bureaucratic looking boring piece of plastic can have.
Well, that's really interesting, and I definitely see the both the membership benefits, but also going back to our theme of this session, the economic benefits. And it'll be interesting to watch that over the long term and to see what happens in New York and in other places as well. So most of Nevada's 500,000 immigrants are in Las Vegas. Immigrants have been drawn to jobs there in the hospitality sector, in the construction sector when there was a recent boom. Although they've been around for, since mid-20th century in some numbers, things really took off during the growth of the late 1990s when a lot of immigrant workers flocked to Nevada and helped build a lot of the growth we've seen. And so now 22% of Las Vegas's and Nevada's total population is foreign-born. But the Great Recession also hit Las Vegas very hard. And Vegas is one of those places that is used to having boom and bust economies, but where immigrants tend to work, the effects tend to go pretty deep in many communities. So if you could talk about both sides of what you do, kind of what you do for the state, and also what you do as a member of this national task force on immigration, that would be great to hear about both.
Sure. So, I'm the son of Cuban immigrants. I was actually born in Brooklyn, but we moved to Vegas when I was 6. A lot of Cubans back then were coming from, even though my parents had come before Castro, a lot of Cubans were coming from that era of Castro, and they were literally going from casinos in Havana to casinos in Las Vegas, and then in the years since that we've had a lot of growth. In fact, yesterday I was at the Circus Hotel, which is one of the older hotels in Las Vegas, and we tend to tear things down and then build them new and bigger, and so we're kind of going through that right now, where we're starting to tear down some stuff and building up some new things. And from the National Council of State Legislatures, we have had this task force for about 10 years. And you mentioned I've actually been in legislature since 2004, which right after that is when I became part of this task force. We've actually been to Nashville. We saw your facility and the wonderful things that you're doing there. We've been to New York with the Fed and looking at economic benefits. We've been all over the country. We've been to the borders, including Washington State, down in Arizona. We've been down in California, and we've even been to Mexico City to talk to Mexico City folks about immigration, to their federal folks. And so we've had this opportunity to look at all these things and kind of suggest some policies. And some of the things that I've seen across the country are amazing what they're doing with immigrants. In Nevada, we've, probably one of the biggest challenges is education. One thing that's different about Nevada than a lot of states is we don't have a state income tax. So all of the money that we get comes from sales tax, property tax. So regardless of your immigration status, everybody in Nevada pays taxes because you have to live somewhere and you have to buy things. And our economic studies that have looked in the past have shown, that our immigrant population actually puts back, like $2-point-something billion, which is greater than the population as a whole. So it's been a real boon for us. But as you mentioned, we're boom or bust, and when the hotels are doing well, then everything else, construction and all those other new jobs. But we do have, and the other thing that we see from immigrants is a lot of the smaller business, the micro businesses, those kinds of things are doing very well. In fact, I remember seeing the ones at yours, the culinary ones that you guys have in Nashville. Amazing, that give you the opportunity to actually have a facility until you can get your own. I've seen a similar thing in Minneapolis. So we're seeing those kinds of things, and in Nevada we have a similar thing. As a legislator, one of the big challenges that we had is as many since the federal folks haven't put in place some type of immigration policy that will work. We see a lot of states doing different things. So in Nevada, one of the things that we did that took me 8 years, but we finally got it through, was to do a driver's authorization card, which is similar to a driver's license, but it's not an ID. But it allows people to drive, be able to get their kids to school, go to the doctor. We already know they were driving, and so this way it gives them an opportunity to take the test and makes the road safer, gives them opportunity to do insurance and those kind of things. But we started that program, I think 3 years ago. We now have 32,000 individuals that have, applied for the card and use it. We have in our education system, we have just in Clark County in Las Vegas area, which is about 80% of the population in Nevada, we have over 80. I could be wrong, it could be more than that, but there's at least 80 different languages that the school district has to deal with. Of course, Hispanic being a large one, Tagalog being another large one. So there's a lot of challenges there. We don't fund anywhere near the national average as far as education, and with all that growth, at our heyday. At the peak, we were building a new school every 20 days in the Las Vegas area, opening up a new school. So over a period of 8 years, we built, I think it was 16 high schools, 32 middle schools, and 60-something elementary schools. We had kids that were going to different schools every year and not moving. And so, we have put some more investment, especially more recently in the last 4 years, into the English language learner program, which as a state we didn't do that. We were using federal money for that, but now we've invested some and seen some great results. There's a program called Zoom Schools that we've put in the high need high English language learner population schools that provides for pre-K. It provides for smaller classes in full-day kindergarten and reading help, summer school, and we've seen some amazing results there. So we've doubled that effort this last legislative session, and now we're looking at actually changing the way we fund schools, the funding formula, to actually reflect the need for English language learners, for special education, for those kinds of things. But one of the things that we talked about the lower skilled jobs, but we consider construction a skilled job because you really somebody has to train them how to do that. And fortunately, when they come from wherever country they're coming from, they're already coming skilled. So while it costs us to educate their children, we didn't have to educate the parents. So there's a cost benefit there, even though it's expensive. But now what we see is these same parents who came because they want to make their lives better for their kids, and worked in the hotels, their kids are not going to school and becoming the doctors and the lawyers and the engineers. And we don't have, in Nevada, we don't have the issue of in-state, out-of-state tuition, depending on your citizenship. We don't, so our kids are able to go to college, and although the cost is still prohibitive in some cases, and we're working on some of those things to try to bring down the cost, especially of community colleges.
I think that's a really important point, this sort of non-quantifiable, and it kind of goes back to some of the discussion of our panelists, of what immigrants bring with them already, and the fact that lower skilled people have skills that are valuable and fit into the labor market in certain ways. Not to put you too much on the spot, but as a state legislator, from what you heard on the panel, and I'm sure you read the whole report on the way here, came on the red eye, so there's a lot of reading going on. But no, from what you've heard, does anything about either the state analyses or the anything in there really resonate with you as a leader concerned with these things in the state of Nevada?
Well, the one thing I know for sure is when you have these types of reports, and we've had a few other ones come out this year that they're very helpful to us as policymakers, because you can look at that. And while there's some, in politics, you're always going to have some folks that it doesn't matter what you present to them, they already know the answer before you even though it's completely wrong. But for the most part, what I've seen, and working, because the NCSL Immigration Task Force is actually bipartisan, it's because I'm a co-chair, so we have a Democrat and Republican that are co-chairs, and the members of the committee are also that way. And so we work together to come up with policies that work. And so when we see these kind of reports, and specifically this one, I think will be very helpful. And it does look at that issue of the national versus the local. And as I mentioned earlier, depends on which state you're from, the kind of impacts, especially fiscally and economically, that you have, and I've seen that as we've gone across the country and seen different states and the challenges that they have and how they fund things. So having that information is important. We have some folks from Georgia and other places where Washington State, where there's a lot of agricultural needs in many parts, and in the whole center part of the Plain states, where they have different challenges with immigrants. And so what we've seen is many states have kind of they're piecemealing immigration policies that benefit them. And so moving forward, what we would hope to see is that that something will get resolved, and we'll get updated immigration policy, but that will also give states the opportunity to be able to customize our individual needs, so that it's not one cookie cutter thing for every state, but that it'll allow us to look at if we need this type of worker, and and Nevada is a great example. While tourism is our bread and butter, we still have mining. We're the number 3 producer of gold in the world, behind Australia and South Africa. We need people for those types of industries, but we've also we've attracted Faraday Futures, who's going to be building electric cars just outside of Las Vegas. We've got Tesla, who's going to be building batteries in the biggest battery factory in the world in northern Nevada. And so we need workers for those industries, and we have technology companies that are coming, and everything now, including when you talk about hotels and hospitality, we don't think of those being technology companies, but everything that they do now is technology, with the gaming and all that. And so we have that great need in Nevada to be able to attract those kind of workers and to be able to educate the ones that we do have.
Well, you mentioned, you phrased it very nicely. I think you said, now I'm going to forget, updated immigration policy.
Yeah.
Okay, so since you went there, I think we'll talk about that. We're in a moment right now where immigration is really top of mind, top of the agenda of a lot of policy discussions taking place nationally with this presidential campaign season, and just it's opened up a lot of discussions across communities. And I'm wondering if you could all talk about some of the challenges that you have on the ground dealing with issues that arise as they arise. And Renata, you talked about bringing Nashvillians together, like resident Nashvillians, and I guess it's fair to say that that Tennessee, for most of its 20th century history, was biracial, had native-born blacks and whites, and then as immigrants started arriving, they kind of intersected this society there and the economy in ways that may or may not have been comfortable. And now we're in a moment where it's sort of the age of inequality. We're talking a lot more about race. We're talking a lot more about immigration and how all of these things intersect. So on the ground, what does it feel like in each of your communities to have these conversations within these contexts? And ultimately, whether you have the right facts, the study facts, some facts that you like, it does often come back to economic issues. And so I was hoping you could all offer some comments.
So as the previous panelist said, right, it's not a simple answer. And certainly Tennessee, even though you might think and still wonder, really Latinos in Tennessee, right? And you also think it's a very conservative state, it's not a black and white story. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. So I would say that if you ask any immigrant in Nashville overall how they feel about life in Nashville, that's exactly why we have grown so much and why these men that I described before brought their families later, because it seems a welcoming place with a decent quality of life, better cost of living. Many of the Latino immigrants that we have in Nashville come both from their countries of origin, but many of them actually are moving from other parts, particularly California and places where the cost of living is higher and where maybe job opportunities are not as available or perceived to be as available as in places like Nashville. Nashville is a place that has been tested maybe like no other places. We, in 2007 to 2009, fought a English-only referendum, and apparently we were the first city of our size that actually took that to the ballot and to the voters, and Nashvillians defeated that in a way of sending a message that that's not who we were and that's not the kind of community that we were building. And so certainly Nashville, I think that the fact that Conexión Americas exists and the center that you visit, Casa Azafrán, which is a nonprofit collaborative that brings together 10 nonprofits under one roof that Conexión developed, funded by government, local foundations, and individuals, is testament to me that Nashvillians believe in the importance of investing in organizations like ours, in efforts like ours to offer tools and resources to our newest neighbors. Now, you get out of Nashville, then you get in rural communities where maybe people have perceived that change and welcome it in different ways. And certainly for many years, up until 3 or 4 years ago, at the state legislature, we were fighting anti-immigrant bills, often 65 of them at a time. And they all were a reflection of just making life harder for immigrants who were coming to Tennessee, in the sense that Tennessee was way too attractive because we were offering driver licenses to undocumented immigrants, or because we just didn't have mechanisms to not be a community where only legal immigrants were welcome. And so, interestingly enough, though, 3 years ago, that changed. And in a way, for the first time, we were able to be for something and not be just defending our community against bad things. And I think, to me, that's also maybe a thermometer that the conversation might change. And even more so, we, for the last 2 years, have been working, and our colleagues at the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, one of our partners at Casa Azafrán in a coalition in the state, has led the effort on the tuition equality, so undocumented kids can go to our schools, our public schools, paying as Tennesseans. In many other states, it had taken 5 years or more to get there. Nashville, in Tennessee, we're not there yet, but the first time that we proposed it, we lost that bill for only 1 vote, which was amazing in its own way. And I have to tell you that actually the co-sponsors of the bill were 2 Republicans, not from Nashville, but one from Chattanooga to our east and one from Memphis to our west side. And that in itself is also a reflection of the understanding of people of all parties that is in their best interest and the economic interest of that community. And in one of the cases for our Senator Gartenhire in Chattanooga, it was because the realization of who was in his community and employers actually bringing to him the fact that we needed to make this potential workforce that we were educating already more integrated into the economic future of Chattanooga. And so I think that certainly, unfortunately, in Tennessee also, like in many places, we are competing to see who can be more unwelcoming often. And certainly in the last year, the effect of the rhetoric from Trump has affected our community too. And if we move forward in the last 2 years on this discussion on tuition equality as a one place where maybe Tennesseans were moving forward thinking that that was a wise investment, that it was in the interest of not just those families, but the economic interest of our state. Certainly we feel that these last few months, we have taken many, many steps back. And actually we're feeling very concerned about the likelihood of this year when we bring this issue for the third time to the legislative session, how much are we going to move forward? And I can tell you that it is an interesting tale of people like Gartenhire in Chattanooga making a case for why we need to open these policies and open the opportunity for these kids to go to college. But then, in the other hand, we're also making sure that Tennessee was not welcoming to Muslim refugees, and we were one of the states that said, "Please don't send us any Syrians." And so, I think that certainly, like many places, we are schizophrenic about our view of who we want in our community at what point. And I think that the work of organizations like ours and elected officials and the partnerships among them is the only way that, and sustained effort, right, that is going to make sure that people understand at a personal level and then also at a community level why all this thing matter. I think that in Nashville in particular, often we feel a little bit complacent that we're a welcoming community. But in fact, I have to say that we are, when you were describing the work, for example, in New York City, an ethos of a immigrant city, right? And then a place like Nashville, where I'm sure in the audience you're still wondering, really, how many immigrants are in Nashville? But I think that I have to say that I'm more hopeful because I also think that it's unexpected for many people in the audience to believe that we have sophisticated networks of support by the nonprofit sector and our local government in how we have responded to the demographic change in the last 20 years. The fact that your task force came to Nashville to see the work of Conexión Américas and Casa Safran.
I didn't mean to diss you.
No. But what I'm saying is,
yes,
no.
Building.
And I know that that's why I'm here. That the reality is that there are more. I am hopeful that that in places like Nashville, I think is where we're testing, like what Americans believe about what it means to be an American. I think that in New York, probably you feel tested in so many ways, but like that's sort of like our golden aspiration, right? That we would be a community where people believe that that's who we are at the most essential way, right? And I think in places like Nashville is where we're testing that definition of what it means to be an American by how we are changed by new people that come to us. And while it's really hard to be hopeful in today's world and in this electoral time, the response of Nashvillians, both elected officials, citizens, and the nonprofits that have grown to respond to that give me hope that maybe we'll get it right.
So before we move to Q&A, which we're going to do in a minute, I'm going to ask you if you would like to briefly make a few more comments.
I would.
Yes.
I'm going to try to be brief.
Okay.
I have so many things to say.
Yes.
But I'm going to try to be brief because I think Renata brought up some really interesting things. New York is different. I think, in reflecting on the last panel, I guess maybe New York is the future. We have 3 million immigrants, about 40% of the population is foreign born, 60% of the population are immigrants or the children of immigrants. 50% of the workforce is foreign-born. Half of the small business owners, immigrants are taxpayers, they're workers, they're employers, they're consumers. It's just, if we're not going to have a functioning city government, we have to have an immigrant inclusion strategy, and we know that. And it's not like a walk in the park. It's the most diverse immigrant population in the country, probably, and so it means that we have to be smart and strategic and tailored in our delivery of services in light of the population in the city. But it's not as controversial of an approach as it might be in other parts of the country, right? Diversity is just kind of who we are. We're proud of our immigrant story in the city. The one thing that's really interesting, though, and as Renata mentioned, is we are increasingly, talking more to our counterparts, like other Moyas throughout the country, about, these best practices, strategies, sharing ideas and innovative programs and policies, and joining together in advocacy, in seeking reforms at the national level. And in the last 2 years, we've helped spearhead the development of a coalition of localities, Cities for Action, that has, I think, over 100 mayors and county leaders now who've joined on. We have monthly calls, we share updates with each other, and then we work together to support the kind of national change that we all really want to see, foremost of which is immigration reform. But we've also come together to urge the president to accept more refugees. Speaking from the local government perspective, we've come together to oppose efforts to defund sanctuary cities. We see that our interest is in really robust national reform for immigrants, and we want to bring that perspective and that voice to the conversation. So I do think that increasingly there's that recognition, and I'm really excited to kind of get into the weeds of the report and sort of figure out what is it in there from the sort of local perspective that will give us more insight into what we're doing.
So I think I'll just quickly talk about, as we look to change policies, things. One of the things that's changed in the last few years, when I got elected, I was the first Latino, or I was the only Latino in the Nevada Assembly. 2 years later, so I'm the son of immigrants. 2 years later, an immigrant got elected. So the two of us became the Hispanic caucus, and that happened, and that stayed that way for I think another 4 years, and then all of a sudden we went from 2 to 8. And we went from being, just members to all of a sudden now I was the majority leader of the Senate. And we've got, committee chairman, and so a lot of the policies changed because people knew that in order that they had to pay attention. But I think more important than even that was that we went from, I think, the immigrant population participation in elections back then to what it is today has changed, and people are paying attention to those kind of things. So we're seeing some changes because the immigrants themselves are becoming more engaged in what's going on, and I think that people are, as the immigrants do so, I think others are seeing, they're seeing these reports that come out. They're seeing, they actually get to know families that are immigrant families and see the type of things that are going on. And so that's all been very helpful in this whole process. So I foresee that that will become even more so, and we'll be able to get better policies because it's, when I first got elected, it was really hard to pass anything that was trying to help the immigrant community. And like I said, it took 8 years, but when we got to that 8th year, doing the driver's license was much easier because I had a lot more people that had been elected, and we had the opportunity, and of course I was the majority leader, but that helped. But the community as a whole turned out and did things. So that's a real important part of this whole mix.
Yeah, I think leadership. What you're all speaking to is this role of state and local leaders in opening up these discussions, no matter how controversial or the conflict and working through them and having the right tone. And it seems like there is a lot going on in the places that you live in and work in. So I wanted to open up to the floor. Any questions? And we have maybe about, I don't know, time for 2 or 3. So we've got one right here.
Hello, good morning. I wanted to ask a sort of an obvious question, because it's always good to hear that immigrants are contributing in successful and constructive ways to the growth of the country, and you have many examples, particularly in New York and Nevada. But the ID topic is certainly huge, and we know why, because there's always a potential for abuse and using it in some way that it shouldn't be used. So can you tell me a little bit more about how you go about, it's now harder, for instance, to get a renewal on an ID here in DC. Now you have to have your birth certificate, where you didn't have to actually have that before. So have you found that there have been problems with that? Has been more forgeries of birth certificates, or any other issues that have come up with people trying to access this card? Because this card obviously can get you a lot of places.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think it's a really good one. I think when we were designing the program, both during the legislative process and the implementation process for the ID NYC card, security of the card was really foremost in mind, because we wanted it to be a robust card that would be widely accepted and could be used as somebody's primary ID. And we knew that being able to ensure the integrity of the card, the integrity of the program would be necessary for that acceptance. One of our main partners in the design implementation process was the New York Police Department, who worked with us really closely to set up the kind of protocols that we would need to be sure that we did know who somebody was when they were applying for a card, that we could confirm their address, so that when we put that information on the card, we could do so with confidence. And we've been really pleased with kind of the safety and the security of the card. Nearly 2 years in, we have a really strong integrity team that has really secure procedures for issuing the cards. We have not found them to be a sort of weaker standard than comparable IDs. And when I say comparable IDs, we've really been looking at state IDs as our peers, just thinking about the size of New York City, the number of New York City residents who don't have a driver's license. We wanted the ID to be able to serve that purpose, at least in the city.
So in Nevada, we're not there yet when it comes to an ID. Even the driver's authorization card specifically says on it not to be used for ID purposes, even though some businesses could. We can't limit businesses from doing that. The other issue too with the driver's issues was the Real ID Act. So that you have to do it in compliance with that. So our card is the alternative. If you don't want a Real ID, then you can get this driver's authorization card. But many businesses still allow for that. The other thing is that the Mexican government, with their Matrícula Consular card, has increased their security measures, so those can be used now. Where in the past, it was a little harder to use that. And some of the other Central American, South American countries, their consular cards are also a little better now. But we've been able to use some of those for ID purposes, especially when you're applying for the driver's license and other things.
Any other questions? I have one right here.
Alejandro Becerra, National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Renata, this is primarily for you. And you probably would appreciate this. Most people do not know that right now there are 400,000 approximately fewer homeowners who are from white households. From 15 years ago, 400,000 fewer white owner households today. At the same time, there's been an increase of nearly 3 million Hispanic homeowner households. To some measure, you've done this in Nashville with your organization. At the same time, Latinos have driven employment growth in the country by more than 2/3 during the last 15 years. The same has occurred in educational gains. There's a lower dropout rate. More Latino kids are attending college, and same thing in business. Latina women are coming up with new businesses at a much higher rate than the rest of the population. Which goes to my question. I had asked Jason Furman, who's the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Conservatives tend to criticize the level of employment right now, claiming that it's false, that even though we're close to near full employment, that the real problem lies with labor force participation rates. It just so happens that Latinos have had a larger labor force participation rate since the year 2000, 69%, as opposed to 66%, which was for the rest of the population. And even today, that same gap continues. It's at an all-time low level, 62 for the country, but it's 66 for Latinos. And the question I asked Mr. Furman is, do you think that the reduction that has occurred among Latinos in labor force participation is due in part to the fact that, as it's reported in the report, there's been a net wash, and in fact some years where we've actually lost immigrants that have gone back.
Is your question?
Yes, my question.
You asked to Jason Furman, one of our leading
yes.
economists, you're going to ask to Renata.
Well, I had hoped to ask Cecilia also that same question. And the other question is the fact that the labor force participation reduction rates, particularly for Hispanics, have lowered. I'm about to finish. Have been lowered because more kids are attending school and staying in school. So that's actually a plus for it's an investment, like you said, in the future.
Yep.
So my question for Corina and especially for Cecilia would be, are you looking at the impact of Latinos on the overall labor force participation rates? Because this is important for people who think that employment is not where it should be.
I just would briefly say, without being able to respond to your macro question, that at a local level in Nashville, labor participation among Latinos and immigrants, it's pretty high. I don't know for other communities. Our concern is more underemployment, right? Like, we know a lot of people are working 2 or 3 jobs because there's no full-time jobs. And underemployment is our concern. It's not participation in the labor force.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of fodder in the report that addresses these issues, either directly or indirectly. Are there any questions from the floor from over here? Or there's one back there, yeah. Actually, I'm told we gotta end. So maybe we can talk at the end, but we've got to stop because we've got our keynote has just arrived. I want to thank our panelists for hanging with us on this topic and this very serious and thick report, and thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
This is a really extraordinary morning, and I am particularly pleased that we've gone from, what was it, Kim used the phrase before, a plethora of economists who bring a lot of insight of a kind, and then to be able to hear what's happening in 3 of America's most dynamic cities and the ways in which that work is playing itself out on the ground, and the ways in which local economies are benefited has really been nice. And we're going to close our program today probably with the most fitting possible way we could have, to end this discussion. I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing the Director of the Domestic Policy Council, Assistant to the President, Cecilia Munoz. Cecilia coordinates the domestic policy making process in the White House, and that, if you think about that sentence for a second, you get a sense of the breadth of responsibilities that Cecilia has had. That means education, that means healthcare and energy and climate change, among so many other things. But probably there's no other issue that's been more a central part of her work and her life than the one we've been talking about today. She has also, relevant to this discussion, played a role previously in helping to manage the White House's relationship with governors, mayors, and other local leaders. So again, understands the difference between the national impact and local government. Prior to joining the administration, Cecilia was at NCLR, National Council of La Raza, where she was Senior Vice President in the Office of Research, Advocacy, and Legislation. As I'm sure you all know, that's the nation's largest Latino civil rights organization, and there she worked on employment, education, health, housing, poverty, farm workers, and of course, immigration policy. So whether it's been from the state level, the city level, looking at the advocate perspective, and now representing the President of the United States in the formulation of his immigration policy in a larger national context, some of the most fraught and divisive times that we've had to lead to. The President could probably have had no better advisor at his side than Cecilia. The MacArthur Foundation, if anyone was watching your news yesterday, may have saw that it announced its fellowships. They don't like, I gather, I'm not sure if they do or not, like to call them the Genius Awards, but they are in fact inspiring young leaders. And Cecilia's career suggests to us their great insight in understanding back in 2000, so 16 years ago, that she was one of the MacArthur Foundation's fellows. We all benefit from her pragmatism, compassion, and resolve in this field, and we're really lucky to have her close out today. Please join me in welcoming Cecilia Munoz.
Thank you, Sarah. What a lovely introduction. Will be very hard to live up to. I'm really, really excited that you're doing this, that you're having this conversation here at the Urban Institute. I'm thrilled both to see the conversation about the economic benefits of immigrants, which are at some level well known, but it's an incredibly important piece of the conversation, but to also dig into the local work that's happening, the work of integrating immigrants. We get an awful lot without being nearly deliberate enough. And one of the things that this administration has been doing, which I'm really very proud of, and I've lost track of her, but my colleague Felicia Escobar, who's standing back there, who works at the Domestic Policy Council, is really helping lead the charge on this question of immigrant integration from the point of view of the federal government. We're actually aligning the federal agencies on this question of immigrant integration to make sure that we're doing our part, along with the likes of the folks that you just saw on your last panel. That's a tremendously important effort, and we are connecting to this welcoming movement as a way of lifting it up and strengthening it, because for all that we get, which I know you have been talking about all morning, economically as well as in other ways from the immigrant community, we can do even better, and we should. And thanks to some of the leaders that are assembled in this room, we are. So I'm really grateful both for that work, but also for your lifting it up, and very grateful to be part of this conversation today. So this is a timely topic. In preparing my remarks and thinking about it and reflecting, I've been doing this work in this town for 30 years. It has never not been a timely topic. It seems that we are always in the thick of a debate on immigrants and their value to this country, their potential for competing with the rest of us, and on the necessity of immigration reform. Clearly, we're in the thick of such a debate now, and I should say at the outset, if folks are interested in or hoping that I would comment on the current public debate, I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you. I'm a government official. We're not commenting on things related to campaigns, tempting though it might be. But I am in a policymaking role, and I can comment on the administration's policy views, on the really interesting and important contributions of the study that you've been discussing today and its findings. It's a very important contribution, and it confirms at some level what has been clear for a long time, well over a decade, and some would say maybe it's been clear for well over a century, And that is that by and large, the economic contributions of immigrants and immigration to this country are critical to our national well-being. That fears about competition within the workforce are vastly overblown. That with the exception of children, who it turns out are expensive, immigrants or not, because we educate them, because it's the right thing to do, that with that perhaps notable exception, the contributions of immigrants and that offspring that we are taking pains to educate are well established and very vital to our well-being, to our future. So we know this. And the study that we've been talking about today provides vital, updated analysis and depth that reconfirms it. So there's room for honest debate here, but really there's no serious argument that immigration is anything but a net positive for our economy. So we also know that if we were to fix what everybody acknowledges is broken about our immigration system, we could do even better than we're doing economically. When the Senate passed its immigration reform proposal most recently in 2013, the Congressional Budget Office found that that proposal would grow the economy by an additional 5.4% compared to the status quo, reduce the federal budget deficit by nearly $850 billion with a B over the next 20 years, reduce the federal debt as a share of the economy by 3 percentage points in 2023, add nearly $300 billion to the Social Security Trust Fund over the next decade, extending Social Security solvency, strengthening the recovery of the housing market. There's a whole host of good things that are now documented that would have resulted from at least from the immigration reform that passed the Senate in 2013. Now, I have spent the last 8 years working alongside the National Economic Council during a period of obviously epic economic downturn, and as the census showed us last week, pretty epic recovery. And I've learned that the arsenal of tools that we have to spur economic growth, especially in the short term, is pretty limited. And frankly, we used every lever that we could get our hands on to come out of the economic recovery. This is the lever that we missed, that we as a nation, a tool that we left on the table that could have provided additional economic growth at a time in which the country was clamoring for it because Congress failed to enact an immigration reform. So the census data shows us we've made huge progress. But the point is that we could have done more with this tool that we left on the table. And the tool is obviously still very much on the table. And even the president's proposed executive actions, which are much more limited than what the Congress could do, had we been able to enact them, we found that, and by we, I mean that in this case, the President's Council of Economic Advisors, would boost economic input by about $250 billion, shrink the deficit by about $65 billion over 10 years, increase the size of the workforce at a time when we need to be doing that, and even get a modest increase in the wages of U.S. citizens and natives of the U.S. So we have probably the most robust documentation of the economic impact and the potential economic benefits of immigration reform than at any point, maybe in our history. And yet the obstacles to doing what's right for the country and for the economy can remain considerable. The debate over this particular round of immigration reform has been going on for over 15 years. And it's not yet clear how long it will continue. So I can't dig in at this moment to the political problem which keeps this debate stuck. But I do want to point out another aspect of its stuckness, if that's a word, which I don't think is getting enough policy attention. So one day, hopefully soon, we're going to get back to the legislative debate about an immigration reform. And we run the very serious risk of repeating the same basic elements of the debate that we have been having for 20 to 30 years. And that includes, and appropriately so, what goes on at the U.S.-Mexico border. But the border and who crosses the border is not what it was 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And we're at risk of having a policy debate which attempts to solve a problem from the 80s and the 90s or the aughts, but not the border that we find ourselves with now in 2016 and beyond. And there are two things that are different. One is the number of people who are crossing, and the second is the nature of migration. This is not the border of the Bush administration or the Clinton administration. So quickly, first, numbers. The number of people who cross every year is relatively low. It's near its lowest point from over the last 40 years. One indicator of that is the number of people apprehended at the border, which is low. But the second is also the number of undocumented people living in the United States. That number has stabilized. Jeff Passell just documented that again this week. So the undocumented population stopped growing in the United States during this administration. That's new. Fewer people are coming. Which is not to say that we don't have substantial challenges at the border, because we do. which gets to the second thing which is different right now, and that is the nature of migration at the U.S.-Mexico border. The challenge remains apprehending people who are trying to give us the slip, particularly from Mexico, but that is a much smaller challenge proportionally, numerically, than it has been before. And the Border Patrol is now facing and managing people who come across and turn themselves in. That's also new. It's an entirely new phenomenon, really, and it's happening mostly from Central America, to a certain extent from Haiti and from other points in the Americas. And as an administration, we've grappled with this by doing 4 basic things. By sheltering, doing a better job of sheltering unaccompanied minors who cross the border. By increasing resources, when Congress is cooperative, for legal representation for immigration judges, for asylum officers. By investing resources, and in this case, Congress did cooperate, particularly in Central America, to address the reasons that people are migrating in the first place. And by, and this was relatively recent, setting up new programs in the region to process people who qualify as refugees directly from the communities that they come from, and providing places for them to go. Most recently, Costa Rica made this announcement, to go to safety if they face immediate danger. But essentially starting refugee processing in the region, which is, again, new. So these are new strategies. And with the exception of the $750 million we got from Congress to help address the situation in Central America, we are frequently executing these new strategies with funds that we find under the proverbial sofa cushions. So I raise this because what you're doing here today contributes very importantly to the debate that we hope to have soon to address our immigration challenges. And if we're going to have a serious debate and capitalize on the economic opportunity that comes with immigration reform, it would be really helpful to have a debate about the border, which we are actually facing right now, a debate that actually addresses the challenges that we see, rather than the ones we faced 10, 20, and 30 years ago, when the rhetoric kind of locked itself in. The issues are different. The conversation should be different, too. So the bottom line here is that, like too many debates in this town, this one gets rooted in a lot of mythology, a lot of emotion. The economic facts, even by eminent scholars like those we've been discussing today, are frequently ignored or disbelieved, as are the facts about what happens on the border. But as a policymaker, I don't sit in the room with myths, even not with emotions so much. We do our best to address the actual challenges that we're facing. We document them, we quantify them, and we even dare to measure the results. And when Congress gets back to addressing this issue in a serious way, it's worth insisting that they do the same thing. So with that, again, I thank you so much for taking on this conversation, for engaging in it in what I hope will be a sustained way, because the contributions of thinkers and doers are incredibly, incredibly important. Thank you for letting me be a part of it, and I'm happy to take a few questions.
That's great. Well, thank you. Please, everyone, join me in thanking Cecilia. Do you know there's another Cecilia Munoz on Twitter, so there are a whole bunch of tweets going to various different folks. So we're going to take just a couple.
Let me. Cecilia 44.
Yes, exactly. That's the right one, not the one I used a few minutes ago. So anyway, we have time for just a couple of questions, so let me start back in the middle of the room there. There we go. Yes.
Me, right?
Okay.
Oh,
fine. Yes. Sorry. I'll get there.
Yes. Cecilia, you might remember me from 100 years ago when you were at La Raza. Mm-hmm. I was interested in the other ue of the border, mm-hmm. our northern border. I know we both come from Michigan, and the question for me is why are we so concerned with only the southern border when we have a basically totally open border with Canada, and no one seems to be concerned about immigration coming from there?
So it's a fair question, and I will say that at least speaking for the agency, for DHS, they are concerned about and work on both borders. The massive personnel is obviously on the southern border, on the U.S.-Mexico border. And look, numerically speaking, including the challenges that I just described, personnel is there because that's where the biggest challenges are. But that's not to say that there aren't challenges and issues at the northern border. I grew up near the border with Canada in Detroit. But so as a policy matter, we deal with both. You're right that the debate tends to focus on one. And we do have challenges there that are reasonable to debate.
So I want to make sure we get a chance to bring a couple people in, so I'm going to ask two people to make a comment, and then you can respond to the themes from those two. So why don't we start there, and then we'll go there. Could get the mic here. Apologize for pointing.
Rachel DeCoste. I'm a graduate student specializing on immigration policy at GW. Thank you for the talk. So I'm one of those Canadians that you should worry about.
There you go.
You talked about how the border is changing and there's some Haitians coming, and can you elaborate on that? Because Haiti's on the other end of the world, so why are they coming through the Mexico border?
Yeah, so this actually just hit the news yesterday. So there are folks who left Haiti and went to Brazil. Brazil has provided visas for Haitians since the earthquake, which was 6 years ago. And for reasons which are still a little bit mysterious, that some number have come all the way from there to San Diego. And so what got announced yesterday by DHS was essentially a renewed effort to apply the same rules and policies to that population that we apply to anybody else who crosses the border, and to frankly send a clear message to folks that as we have with Central Americans and others, the border's not open. Obviously, if folks have asylum claims or other humanitarian concerns, we take those very seriously and we address them, but DHS announced yesterday that it will detain and remove the folks that they find unless those humanitarian considerations apply.
Right here, thank you.
Hi, Jack Camino, Doña Cecilia. I think I agree that dealing with facts and not myths, but I don't agree that don't dealing with emotions. I've met immigrants with no documents, and I found that without that deep research, but I found because I feel there is a pain that need to be healed. So you guys, I think, need to practice humanity to find a solution to the problem. So practicing humanity needs emotion.
Sure. That's a fair point. I guess I would draw the distinction in a slightly different way, but I don't think it means that we disagree with each other. When I say the debate gets emotional, part of what I mean is that we drive away from the facts, from what we know, from what the economic evidence shows, for example. And some of this debate gets driven by fear. When I say we don't necessarily bring emotion into the policymaking process, that is not to say that we don't bring our values into the policymaking process. And that's where I think you and I are probably more aligned than not. Look, we are, and I can never be as eloquent as my boss. We're a nation of immigrants and a nation of laws. We balance those things, and neither the president nor I believe that those things have to be in conflict. We are who we are because of this history, and that's also our future. It's part of what makes us unique on the planet. It's part of what makes us strong. That we absolutely bring into the policymaking process. That informed our work on immigration reform. It informs our work on the border. It informed the enforcement priorities that the president put forward. It certainly informed our work in creating for the first time and working with UNHCR and others refugee processing in the hemisphere. Because there's an incredibly dangerous situation in Central America. So I agree with you that we have to apply values. I guess with respect to policymaking, as, again, the conversation today richly shows, there's just a very big gulf between what we know, what the evidence shows, and the direction that the debate often takes. And, this isn't the only debate in which we struggle hard to make sure that the facts actually drive policymaking. I think that's tremendously important.
So I think I'm going to try to bring it to close, and I just wanted to kind of knit a comment that you made with the earlier discussion today and talk a little bit about the work we all, I think, want to do going forward. You talked about the administration's efforts to encourage the welcoming cities and the immigrant integration. We heard this morning from the panel about the values of economic growth that bring, and also some of the challenges for communities as they're dealing with the impact of immigrant populations in their communities in the near term with certain costs. But we also understand that there are ways in which we can help to ensure that we achieve some of the economic benefits, and barriers that we can remove to increase and enrich our capacity to get the value of immigrant integration. And so one of the things that I know that my colleagues at USC and at Urban are interested in exploring is really figuring out what are the things that work, what are the things that help to ensure that the immigrants that come here are able to take advantage of the richness of this and are able to contribute back to our economy and to the communities that they live in. And particularly by looking at that in places, I think, and sort of looking at it cities by city and state by state and finding where those best practices are, where we're able to help make sure that the potential described in the report is achieved, and that we can avoid some of the costs that so many people seem to fear. So with that, I want to thank everybody for spending your patience this morning. I hope you found it as extraordinary a conversation as I did. Thank you, Cecilia, for being with us and for your encouragement in this work. And thank you to everyone, especially who worked for 3 years hard on the National Academies panel, for their terrific contribution to this discussion. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night. It was terrific, and it really shows that people are paying attention.